for this lecture, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at World War II and America, but specifically we're going to look at how did World War II impact what we would call the American home front. We did this a little bit when we talked about World War I, but we've got this massive global war going on the other side of the country. But how did the war impact everyday Americans? And we're going to look at just a few things. To do this, I'm going to go onto our unit page, and there's a handout that's already on here for you to see. And I'm just going to use it to kind of talk through this topic a little bit. Down here in the links, there are several things here that could help today. There's a court case, Korematsu versus the United States. Women in Wartime, talks a little bit about Rosie the Riveter. It's similar to our discussion board that we did. And then A. Philip Randolph's speech. This is about African Americans marching on Washington or attempting to march on Washington for job opportunities during the war. So these are three things that you could look at, and I will reference. But the document that I'm actually going to use today is this first one. It's called Fill in the Blank Notes. So if you click on that, if you want to follow along or look back at this later, you can do that. And it's essentially just a handout with some fill in the blanks. What you'll see is I've already done the fill in the blanks for you. They're filled in over here. So when you pull that up, if you click on the block, it will kind of show you what the fill in is. So nothing that you have to do other than just listen right now. And I'm not just going to read it to you, but you can definitely read through this, study it, and use it to try to get an understanding of what's going on. This is 4 pages. We're only going to look at the first 2 pages. This first page is a little bit of review from the time between the wars, and then the second page is about the home front. So just real quick, most Americans, if you remember, before the war, we wanted isolation. We wanted to be neutral and keep out. However, even though public opinion was kind of for staying out, our president, FDR, says, I think America has a responsibility. We're powerful, and we need to engage in World War II. If America doesn't engage, Nazism, dictatorships, perhaps communism, those could become the dominant ideas that kind of organize how the world works. FDR says he wants to step in and be the arsenal of democracy. And that was specifically about the Lend-Lease Act, but it was this idea that America had to get involved to promote a few other things FDR did, the cash and carry policy. At one point in 1940, he traded American destroyers for naval bases. He was preparing for a war against Japan by accumulating naval bases. He traded some old destroyers for access to British naval bases. In 1940, it's the only time in history that I know of that we did this, but we passed a peacetime military draft, meaning that we were building our army even before we were in the war. And then finally with Japan, we studied and we talked about how the attack on Pearl Harbor brings America into the war and changes public opinion. We did embargo trade with Japan first, but then on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and we went to war. Okay, so that's all kind of review. How does the war impact Americans at home? So this next page is about the home front. I did have you watch a video last week on mobilization, and it talked about how manufacturing industries, peacetime industries that were struggling during the Great Depression or they're going to kick into gear for wartime production. We went from having record unemployment to during the war, we had a surplus. We had more than enough workers. One of my favorite statistics from that video, and you guys shared several with me, was how before the war, companies like Ford and Chrysler were making millions of cars. And then for the 4 years that America was at war, those companies only made 300 cars because all of their capacities and resources and things were being used to make B-24 long range. I think that's it's crazy, and it's cool to think about how consumer goods were converted to wartime goods because the people saw a need and bought into it. Now, how did this affect everyday Americans? Well, people were working now. That doesn't mean that the conditions and the pay was great, but labor unions, they pledged not to strike during the war. In other words, owners and workers said, hey, let's maybe sacrifice our self-good, or I wanted that raise, or I wanted these better accommodations at work, but I'm going to sacrifice that. We're not going to strike. We're not going to fight about it until the war is over. So workers were able to work, maybe not the best conditions, maybe not the best pay, but they were getting the job done. There was a new government agency called the War Productions Board. You say, well, who organized all of that conversion? Who told Ford, what was needed? Who told these other companies, what rations needed to be developed, or how many, or in what quantities? The government. This was very hands-on government, and the War Production Board, organized all that. Certainly, women played a huge part in the war. We looked at these images of Rosie the Riveter. It is important to note there is no just one Rosie the Riveter. There were models for those posters, but in general, Rosie the Riveter is an icon. She's a symbol of the women that went into the factories and worked and served in that way, while men went away to fight. And that's something I think most of us have learned in other classes, that when women were not allowed in those times to serve in combat roles, men went away and women filled those jobs, and it was a huge blessing to our country. But it also raises all kinds of questions about masculinity and femininity, and what does it mean to be a man, and what does it mean to be a woman? And those are conversations that are still happening today. And I think 1940s were a pivotal point, or a pivotal shifting point in how women saw themselves and how the rest of the world saw women. One thing that was happening, though, in jobs is, as men left and jobs opened up, women filled those jobs. But what about African Americans? Many companies were still racist, or had racist owners, or had discriminatory policies, or just refused to hire people of color to come in and work. FDR got involved. If you go back to that other document, a labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, who was Black, he said, we're going to have a march on Washington and demand that Black Americans have access to these wartime jobs. The march didn't actually happen because FDR responded before the march. FDR passed an executive order that prohibited racial discrimination by any company receiving government contracts. So if you're Ford and you're going to get money from the government to build these planes, well, you can't racially discriminate. That was a condition that FDR ordered, and it opened up opportunities for African Americans to move north, to get new jobs in different industries and get training. So that ends up being a good thing. Side note, about 20 years later, when the civil rights movement will be going on, we're going to talk about Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington. Where did civil rights leaders get this idea to march on Washington and demand change? You can look back here to World War II and A. Philip Randolph. Another example of men going away to war and people needing to fill those jobs. Immigrants come to our country. Specifically now, we're not talking about European immigrants, but we're talking about Mexican immigrants. In the West, in places like California and the Southwest, a lot of the jobs that were vacated were agricultural jobs. And Mexican immigrants would come across and come into our country, and they provided necessary farm labor to feed our country and to do things like that. This was encouraged by the government. It was called the Bracero program. Of course, the sad part of this story, and this is kind of true for women and people of color as well, when the war is over and men return from war, a lot of times Mexican immigrants were then discriminated against or put out of work, and that's going to be a struggle in the 1950s. There was also sacrifice made by everyday Americans. The government placed restrictions on things. If you've ever heard of this idea of rationing, that you couldn't just go to the store and buy all the bread that you wanted or all the canned goods that you wanted. You had limits, and there were little booklets that you would get stamped at the store that shows I'm only consuming a limited amount. This would make sure that there was enough food and supplies for the whole country and for the military. The government put wage and price controls in. The regular laws of supply and demand were kind of pushed aside, and the government dictated wages and prices for a short period of time. This was called the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. And the last thing that I want to talk about as far as the war's impact on the home front is it says hate here on this handout, but this is really talking about race and prejudice and discrimination. We went to war against Japan, but there were hundreds of thousands of Americans who had Japanese ancestry. We had Japanese immigrants coming to America for years, and we had first generation, second, third generation Japanese Americans that lived in our country. During World War II, there was some terrible things done to people of Japanese ancestry. The Japanese were dehumanized, and there was discrimination. People were paranoid that people of Japanese ancestry might promote a further attack like Pearl Harbor. And in 1942, on the West Coast, Japanese Americans were rounded up and placed into internment camps. So this is actually a very bad thing that FDR does. FDR passed one executive order to help Black Americans get jobs, but he also passed an executive order that placed Japanese Americans in internment camps. And I'm going to have you watch a video and do an assignment on this. But long story short, thousands of Japanese Americans are placed in essentially prison camps for the duration of the war, upwards of 3 years. These Japanese Americans, they challenged this in the Supreme Court in a court case called Korematsu versus the United States. And again, you can read about this on that other link on the unit page. The Supreme Court voted 6-3 to uphold the internment of these American citizens. So Japanese Americans were arrested, placed into camps for the duration of war, and when they challenged that in court, they lost, and those prison camps were upheld. So, that, to my mind, is certainly a sad thing. This is an example of during an emergency, during wartime, certain civil liberties have not been upheld. And that's a pattern that we see throughout American history, that when there's a tension between an emergency and rights, a lot of times our courts and our country has erred on the side of security or the crisis and not in favor of rights. I think the last blank on here goes back to talk a little bit about Black Americans and racial discrimination. Black soldiers did serve in the military, but in segregated units. So that's not really home front, but it does have to do with race. Okay, these are some big ideas. I do want you to know some things about how the war impacted the home front, know about mobilizing the economy, know about jobs, know a little bit about rationing and prices, and certainly know about Japanese internment. And I think if you have these big ideas, you'll have at least an idea of how World War II impacted the American home front. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.